All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Looks like we've already got quite a crowd on here. Appreciate everyone making time to do this with us and choosing to be present and participate on Wednesday nights. So the last couple of weeks have been a bit different. Wasn't I'll tell you at the end of class, we got something special coming up next week as well, unfortunately, but a couple of weeks ago, what happened is that my grandmother passed away, and we ended up having to make a quick trip to Nashville. So that just kind of interrupted my class plans. And then we were still, out traveling. So last week on Wednesday night, we premiered a new podcast. I'll reference that again at the end of this, but I think right now Kevin has it posted only on Facebook. I need to make sure we also get it in our YouTube channel, but called King's Cast. Kevin and Justin and myself and Crystal thought that we could get our ministers on staff to sit down and talk about some things together, and we enjoyed doing it. I think it was kind of a fun conversation, but we played that last week since I still wasn't able to be back to get class together. So yeah, we had 1 week off and 1 week that was a bit different. This week we're going back to normal, but because of the new streaming capabilities that we have actually live streamed our last two Sundays. We had been trying to find a time to get together a lot of our volunteers and really rehearse, how to use the different hardware and software to let them practice turning volumes up and down. And so next Wednesday night, on Wednesdays, there is a group that meets at our building to practice songs for Sunday, to learn new songs, just a group who likes to sing. And the intention is next Wednesday night, I intend to actually go ahead and live stream it. So if y'all wanted to tune in anyway and give us feedback on, I can hear this, I cannot hear this, I can see this okay, or you could, we actually really, it helps us a lot getting your feedback as we fine tune things. But we got several people who volunteer in our AV room, and I just wanted to make sure each of them has the chance to really learn how to do all the different roles now, because we've got some new technology that we've added. And so we needed to do that sometime. It looks like that's going to be next week. So wanted to mention that. And Tom, it's good that we scheduled that for next week, because you're not able to be there tonight. So yeah, we'll look forward to doing all that next week and giving everyone the chance to learn how to use some of this stuff. But really, even for us, still having to kind of work through the learning curve, I'm already very, very pleased with the direction that things are moving with our streaming content. Something that's kind of a side topic that I think it's interesting to ponder these days, as we are trying to figure out what church looks like moving forward. It is not the case, I don't think, that any church, especially when we've gone as far as we have to try and get better in our digital presence, it is not the case that we want to just cut all the new stuff loose and revert back to just doing everything in person. Nor is it the case, I think, that it's wise to simply focus on only the in-person experience and just kind of, record that or place that up where people could just kind of view it as an outsider. But I'm thinking increasingly about what it means to take a hybrid approach, to where I don't want in any way to devalue the importance of what we're doing in person, but it is the case now that we really can assume much of the time that I have people who are participating online. And of course, here on Wednesday nights, we're doing more online than we are doing in person. So some parts of the week, the balance is a little bit flip-flopped. But I may be doing some experimenting in the next weeks and months, just trying to figure out how can we best engage both those who are present and with us versus those who are watching us online, and might there be some things we can do or incorporate that would be good and make it more meaningful for everyone. Maybe I'm thinking a lot about how to do better interactions with people as we go. So that's just kind of a spoiler alert, but that's stewing right now on the back burner. I'm just we're all struggling with how to move forward and what that ought to look like. So great to have you all here tonight. Let me get on over to my slides. I don't know if you know this, by the way. I've always had my fake room background, because I'm here on a green screen. And I took some pictures of my actual office the other day. So now I'm at least pretending to be in a real place that I would normally occupy. So there's a real picture of my office, but rendered as a green screen. Okay. Story of God's People is what we've been studying on Wednesday nights. You can find all the previous lessons on YouTube or on our Facebook page. We're here most Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. and you can find our channels. Just look for King's Crossing Church of Christ. And at this point, we've really got an incredible amount of content that we've been putting out, especially during quarantine, because we not only have all the sermons since 2000, mid 2017, but we have lots of our Bible classes have been there. Kevin's doing a Sunday afternoon class. I've gotten several of my Wednesday night sessions up there. I haven't been posting them all as much lately, but man, there's just a lot of content there to engage with. It's worth having a look. All right, so Story of God's People. I've got extra copies of this book. If you would like a copy, need a copy. Yeah, thanks Easter. Yeah, I know there's a lot of different ways to go about some of this stuff. I'm thinking about, what does it look like? I think the worship leaders are doing a great job of pausing and acknowledging our people who are viewing online, but what does it look like to do it well, where even though we're focusing on a quality in-person experience, somehow there's some ways to incorporate the online audience, maybe in ways that have never been done before. So working on some ideas, but yeah, that's good. Okay. The cross of Christ. Boy, this is a tough topic to take a couple of weeks off and then to jump back in. The cross of Christ. I think there are some ways in which I can certainly appreciate how an outsider looking into Christianity would view an event like the crucifixion and say, what exactly are you claiming that this accomplished? And some Jewish guy that got wrongfully put to death 2,000 years ago, like, what does that actually have to do with me or anything that I've done? After all, that is kind of the line we hear a lot these days about, why should I apologize for something that someone did years and years ago that I had nothing to do with? Well, how can someone who did something years and years ago have anything to do with you? And I think there's a lot to pick through when we talk about Jesus's death and what it meant and what it means. And I'm just kind of curious for you, if you ever get put on the spot and asked that question and someone says to you, what's the significance of the crucifixion? Why does it matter? What difference does it make? I'm kind of interested if y'all have comments on that. What would your brief response or maybe lengthy response be to that? All right, so that's our topic for this evening. I believe this is lesson 9, I think, in the study. So we've got a few weeks to go, and if you have thoughts on stuff you'd like to study next, I'm open to those. Here's a question I was thinking about this afternoon, reflecting on the nature of Jesus' death. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt outnumbered and outgunned? Maybe you have been a sports fan on enemy territory, cheering for what most people would view as the wrong team, and you feel like it's probably okay, but depending on where you are and how drunk the people are around you, you start thinking, maybe I should cheer a little quieter. Maybe you've been in a situation in life where things just got really seriously bad, and you were up against something. Maybe it was a physical threat. I know a person who ended up, and this is not anyone that anyone here is connected to, but I know of a person who ended up in a really sad situation with his spouse. They ended up divorcing, but even as they were fighting for custody of the children, at some point he ran out of money and she had better lawyers, and just in this situation he was really kind of the innocent party. But sometimes you're in a situation where you just feel that the odds are stacked against you and it's hard to know what you can do. I don't know what it was like to be Jesus, knowing all the things that he knew, yet still feeling all the things that we would feel with an imminent threat of physical violence, of being misunderstood, of being ostracized, of being shamed. Jesus didn't exempt himself from any of those things that we feel. So whatever crucifixion was like, I think at the very least, it must have felt like a very lonely place for him. Yeah, it is important for us to know and accept history, not try to deny or change the truth. And that's a real challenge, isn't it, Brenda? Because if you can't trust your history books, it's like the old 1984 stuff. If someone gets to dictate what history is supposed to say and what it's all supposed to mean, and there's no room for pushback or variation, and history is subject to change at the whim of whoever's in power, that's a pretty bad spot to be, isn't it? So, with all of its good things and its bad things, it's good for us to know history. I've been reminded of that many times in this study of Abraham that we're doing on Sunday mornings. As I've alluded to numerous times for you all, Abraham was not just this squeaky clean, clear cut, uber righteous person who never made any mistakes. He made what I would consider some pretty significant blunders. Some of the cultural sensitivities that are different now than they were then. There's several of those stories that make me super uncomfortable with especially how women are treated so typically in the ancient world. You're right, though. It's something I like about the Bible is that the Bible doesn't shy back from the embarrassing details. It's really the full picture. It's the full humanity. And there's something very redemptive about that. Much like the crucifixion, right? That Jesus came as a human being and suffered and experienced the worst that the world could offer. Something about that's very helpful and redemptive, because it's like he didn't just go deep enough to be bothered. Instead, he went like all the way to the bottom of the barrel, right? He humbled himself to the absolute furthest extent that he could. And for that reason, when he redeems us, it's a powerful redemption that can reach to the depths of our despair and depravity. So, just kind of curious, maybe you've had an experience where you felt outnumbered or outgunned. All right, so what I wanted to do tonight, one of the challenges with this study is that I have obviously assigned those extra readings you can do to help you get a feel for the sections that we're talking about. But because of the sweeping nature of this study, sometimes it's hard to know what the balance is of being too general and broad to explain the movement versus how much can you zoom in without getting bogged down. What I decided to do for this evening is I thought it really is worth reading through a pretty good chunk of at least one of the crucifixion stories, just because it is so significant. This is, of all the chapters in the book, most of them deal with like periods of time. These last few chapters, the New Testament obviously spans much less time than the Old Testament does, so all of them are intrinsically more specific, but trying to figure out how to divide up the life of Jesus. I did just kind of do the life and teachings, and then this chapter, which is the death and the resurrection. But I thought it might be worthwhile to read through this with you, just to remind ourselves of some of the details. And so as we go, you're more than welcome to comment on these passages and reflect with me on what you see, what you think about. I'm picking up here in Luke 23, where there's a situation where Pilate could have released a prisoner to them. It was a tradition. And he said, "Would you like me to release this guy?" Thinking, Jesus is innocent for all he could tell. And despite the stuff he's doing, whatever he's doing that's irritating the Jewish leaders, he's not violent. He hasn't hurt anybody. And so he got this guy, Barabbas, who had to have been very notorious. This is a guy with a bad reputation who has bad intent. Not good for people for this guy to be on the loose. And so he gives them what should have been an apples and oranges choices where one was really obvious, and they picked the other. And I think he was unprepared for that. This is a guy who's trying really hard to dodge accountability for what he has the power to do. He could have released Jesus. He didn't have to put him to death. He had the power to change the situation, but he's kind of looking for every possible way out here. Let me read through this text. But the whole crowd shouted, "Away with this man, release Barabbas to us." Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." For the third time he spoke to them. "Why? What crime has this man committed? I found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore, I'll have him punished and then release him." He keeps trying to negotiate with him. I could do something less. We don't have to crucify this guy, and I don't really see any reason to do it. And again, those of us on the outside looking in, not feeling that pressure, would probably want to comment, well, if you don't have to do it, then why are you doing it? So He's caving clearly to the crowds here. But with loud shouts, they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. It's never a great way to make decisions, is it? Whoever shouts the loudest gets what they want. That's a real dilemma these days, because sometimes I feel like I'm seeing various groups shouting loudly about things they feel passionate about. Sometimes I find myself in alignment with their thinking. Sometimes I find myself at odds with their thinking. It never seems to me like shouting versus shouting is a real good way to govern or to get anything done well. I mean, you get stuff done if people are angry enough and make a big enough fuss, but it doesn't seem like a lot of the time we do our best thinking when we're part of a mob who's all screaming. But that's what they do here. They just shout louder and louder and louder, and it's up in a frenzy. And he doesn't want to be embarrassed by letting his superiors know that he can't govern this area well. And so he decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. So he is letting them have their way here. And so I believe I'm skipping ahead just a bit. Yeah. So this is once we get to the scene of the crucifixion. Jesus has some conversation along the way with some of the ladies who've been his companions in ministry. There's also Simon that they grab and force to help him carry the cross because Jesus is too weakened. Two other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. Boy, verse 34 is worth pausing on, isn't it? That they're in the middle of killing him, and Jesus is more concerned with forgiving them than he is with his own pain, embarrassment, unjust treatment, any of that stuff. Says something about trying to be the, I guess, mature person in the room. I mean, you hate to reduce this whole situation just to a matter of like maturity, immaturity, but something about the way Jesus acts here, like I look at him and I'm like, this is a real adult, right? This is a guy who knows who he is. He's not caving under the situation. He's not cowering. He's acting from a place of conviction. Jesus is acting rather than reacting. He is very much himself. That was something that John's Gospel points out, I believe, when we studied through John's Gospel last year, is that when you see Jesus being crucified, it's because Jesus chooses to submit himself to this kind of a death. So it's not that Jesus was overpowered. They didn't outsmart him. They didn't trick him. I mean, they tried, but that wasn't what was really happening. Jesus was well aware of what was going on. Yeah, so this is the problem with studying the Gospels, Kathy, is that Jesus has such an amazing talent for getting rid of our excuses for things, right? Like, no matter what you've endured, it wasn't as bad as what he endured. No matter what you're struggling to forgive, it wasn't as hard to forgive as whatever he forgave. Yeah, Jesus just gives such an incredible example of forgiveness. And it's one of the reasons, frankly, I have preached I preached the Gospel of Mark not long after I got here, and then we preached John's Gospel last year. But candidly, I really hesitate a lot of times to do deep dives into preaching Jesus' teachings just because they cut to the core so much. And it's hard, too, to not want to be hypocritical, right? Like, I don't want to get up and tell you all what to do that I won't practice or am not practicing myself. And Jesus has such a way of just kind of, stripping things down to the bone where you just can't dodge it and you can't cushion it. But Jesus hanging on the cross, forgiving those who are killing him. Yeah, you're exactly right. We got no excuses left. Let's see. Yeah, Jesus was resigned to do his Father's will in order to save those who were crucifying him. Yeah, so again, he's operating on principle. Jesus is not reacting. He's operating on principle. He's obeying his Father's will. There's something wise about this for us, especially those of us who are trying to be leaders within the church. that, it is just being honest, right? Like there are some people who try to be loud in order to get what they want, or they try to apply pressure in a variety of different ways. But there's something to be said for acting from conviction. The sorting mechanism that decides what we do next has got to be God's mission. If what we're doing is furthering the mission and is helping us reach people for Christ more effectively, then we should take it seriously. And if the thing we're doing is hindering that process, no matter how many years we've done it or how much we like it, we've got to be humble enough to take a real hard look at stuff and say, it's not about me getting my way because I'm the preacher. It's not about the elders getting their way. It's not about the loudest group or the group with the most resources getting their way. It should always be the will of God that, God gets his way. And that should be the primary thing. And we know that God's will is for us to bear fruit and to reach people. And so those have got to be high priorities for us. Not that we don't value all those other things, but if we're in a head-to-head kind of deal where it's this versus this, the will of God is what's always got to win. It's always got to win that debate. So they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he's God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself." So, man, there's a lot to pick apart here. So if you're wondering what it looks like to be Jesus walking to the cross and being placed on the cross, as you look around you, what you see are a bunch of people who are hostile towards you. I mean, sneering, baring their teeth, scowling, shaking their heads, muttering, clearly talking about him. It's a miserable place to be. That's right. I can't even begin to understand how to be so selfless. Only with the help of the Holy Spirit. And Sandy, isn't it great to know that the same Holy Spirit at work in Jesus, helping him to show this character that he demonstrates on the cross, that same Holy Spirit lives within each of us who are Christians. We have so much help available to us if we would only get, I don't want to say better, we just need to be more aware of God's presence, and that God's desire is to help us and to call us to greater peace and comfort and purpose. The help of the Holy Spirit is not a thing to speak lightly of or to disregard. And again, keep these comments coming. I just wanted to read through this story. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, for the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he had said this, he breathed his last. The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, "Surely this was a righteous man." When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. But all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. There's a lot you can unpack and think about, especially pertaining to the darkness, the tearing of the temple curtain. Depending on who you talk to, I've known some people who've tried to say that what Jesus is experiencing here is that because he has taken sin upon himself, he is actually experiencing God-forsakenness, and the darkness is the fact that God is looking the other direction. I am more in the camp of believing that many of the times in Scripture where you see especially thick clouds and darkness and thunder, those are actually the times when God is most near. Think about when Moses is getting the commandments. When he's going to the mountain, how did people feel about the mountain? They're terrified because it's thick smoke, blackness, clouds. So when you see darkness surrounding I don't think we should just assume that God has abandoned him. I think if nothing else, God may just be radically present at the cross. Likewise, with the tearing of the curtain of the temple, this is not like a Bed Bath & Beyond curtain that anybody who's a little rough on it could probably tear. Very, very thick curtain in place because they didn't want any possibility of someone getting close to the Ark of the Covenant. It was the very presence of God that rested there on the mercy seat. So when we're talking about the veil of the curtain tearing, this wasn't something that anyone could just do, not to mention how high this thing was. It was an enormous piece of fabric, and it would have been a massive undertaking to tear it. So it's an act of God, clearly is what the text is implying. But what does it mean? If nothing else, it certainly means that now the holy place where no one could go is open to people. And so now, there's this dividing wall of hostility between God and man. Jesus has, has torn it apart. And so the division is no longer there. On that point, once again, and I mentioned this in the chapter, I believe, but I tend to gravitate toward, so one thing I think you have to assume, Cheryl, is that anytime the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, New Testament writers mostly assume that you would be very familiar with the Old Testament and studying it religiously, I guess pun intended somewhat. But I think anytime you see a verse quoted, it is the intent that you would kind of look at the whole chapter as well, or at least the whole section where that verse comes from. So it's their way of kind of referencing. Everybody knows Psalm 22. But yeah, when Jesus quotes Psalm 22, does he just quote that verse? Does he quote the whole thing? He is certainly feeling forsaken, right? He is echoing David's concerns. I don't think I've got a New Testament handy. I don't have my old. I've been looking at different New Testament, Old Testaments lately. I don't have one handy to pull out, but looking at Psalm 22, it starts off in a God-forsaken, sad, desperate place, ends up in a more positive place. Then, of course, Psalm 23 follows Psalm 22. Wonderful, wonderful chapter. And it's great to read those next to each other because, to me, each one kind of enriches the other. Let's see. So we were talking about, the tearing of the temple curtain. Something that I would encourage us also to be thinking about here is that the expression of deep grief and mourning that we see throughout Scripture that is culturally normal would be if you were in a point of absolute grief beyond comprehension, the thing that you did was you tore your clothing. And so when someone gets just horrendous, life-wrecking news about something that's happened to someone they love, a lot of times they'll tear their clothing as a sign of deep grief. I believe that just as the tearing of the temple veil, gets rid of that wall that separates us, I also think you have to look at, trying not to go there too much in my head or I'll get emotional, but the picture of God himself grieving. Boy, that's profound. For the temple, if the way that everyone grieves is to rip their garment in half, then what you see is, again, not a God who is absent. Even if sometimes you might feel alone, even when you discover you're not really alone. Jesus is feeling, at least appears he's feeling God forsaken. But I think in some of what we see, the presence of great darkness, the tearing of the temple curtain, this to me looks like a God who is really heartbroken. So this is a tough lesson to have to work through, but pretty significant. We have the testimony of the centurion who doesn't really know much, but says, I don't think this was a bad guy. I think this was a righteous person, and whatever just happened, what have we done? And that's the big message that pops up in Acts chapter 2, isn't it? When Peter's preaching and he tells kind of the story of Israel leading up to Jesus and how Jesus is the culmination of all this. And we all love Acts 2:38, but just preceding it, there's the big question. Once they realize what they've done, they say, what can we possibly do? We killed the Son of God, the one that was sent that we've been waiting for. We've murdered him. What can we possibly do now? So, yeah, there's some confusion that ensues after Jesus' death, certainly. Okay, I wanted to reflect with you. And, of course, resurrection is also a huge part of this because without the resurrection, the claims that Jesus made before his crucifixion really wouldn't hold up. Jesus being raised from the dead verifies, authenticates who he claimed to be. I wanted to reflect with you a little bit on coercion versus what I would call kind of compassion and truth-telling. In the chapter that I wrote in the book on this, I was referencing kind of the way that you see cartels work, where, very heavy-handed intimidation, total control, any resistance at all is met with just brute force and treachery, and people are afraid to do anything different. Now, the problem with people who rule like dictators is they've only got power for just as long as they can convince the people that they're stronger. But the second a person believes they don't have to show respect or deference to a person like that, they are done with them and might even, retaliate against them. Coercion is a terrible way to govern over people. But Jesus, as our king, that's what the Messiah is. He's God's anointed. As our king, he is a person who chooses instead to operate by both compassion and truth-telling. That Jesus is consistently kind. He is consistently paying attention to the folks on the margins. One of the things I love about Luke's gospel is all the women and Gentiles he's constantly talking about. He doesn't leave them out of the story because Jesus didn't leave them out of his life. Jesus was always open to everyone. Jesus, despite the fact that he was the best of us, he never acted like he was too good for anyone. But Jesus is compassionate, but then he's also, I hate to say brutally honest, but he just doesn't keep secrets and he doesn't hold things back, and he refuses to dance around rather than to speak clearly about whatever's going on. I'm always amazed by some of his parables. This is, some of the stuff you don't want to preach is like, Jesus goes to a party, and while he's at the party, he tells a parable about the people sitting there and tells them, well, you really should have taken the humble seat and let someone elevate you rather than all fighting over the seat of honor. Jesus isn't always polite by the world's standards, but he is honest and he is good. And those things kind of outweigh anything else. But I think it's worth reflecting on just the difference in leadership styles, for lack of a better term. Brenda mentions here, being in the form of man, Jesus must have felt as any man would, alone and sad to take on all the sin of mankind. And that's a big dynamic of this, isn't it, Brenda? Is that Jesus is not just kind of guilty and got a worse punishment than he deserved, but Jesus becomes like our scapegoat, where the sins of the world are placed on his shoulders. And even though he didn't deserve it, I love that Jesus's response to injustice was, he's not happy about it, but what he does is that he shoulders it. He carries it, he takes it on himself, and he summons himself to be an even better version than what we've seen of Jesus. As good as he was up to that point, seeing his final acts on the cross are a culmination of all these other things, where he does pray for the people who are persecuting him, and he does forgive the people who are murdering him. But for Jesus to kind of show the best of himself in his worst moment, it's really profound. Alone, sad, and overwhelmed, Randall says. Yeah, so it's a powerful and a profound situation. Wanted also to reflect on, when we talk about the cross, there's kind of different angles we go on it. For whatever reason, I feel like most of my experiences growing up are that whoever's preaching will kind of go into some sort of a physician mode and just kind of describe what it is that causes pain. And I did a bit of that in this chapter, talking about where crucifixion likely took place. There's a lot of nerves. Are only, normally they would just throw crucified bodies to the dogs. So we have very, very few like crucified remains. We do have one from the first century around the time that Jesus was crucified. And most likely, both of his hands would have been stretched out, but they would have had his legs more the way you would ride a bicycle, probably nailed into the two sides of the cross rather than, crossing his feet. I don't know how, one of the issues is just how in the world do you drive a nail through people's feet like that? Like, it'd be really hard to get any leverage on it. But the remains that we have, the feet had been nailed to the side of the cross, which also explains how Jesus would have been able to, kind of lift himself up, painfully so, but to be able to breathe. Asphyxiation is ultimately the result of crucifixion. But so there's different ways to think about the pain of the cross. The physical pain is often the one we talk about, but it is not the only issue going on here. There is the physical pain, which was just absolutely brutal. But there was also the emotional pain going on. One of his 12 has betrayed him. The friends who should have been willing to die with him have run off. Everyone he had ever done anything good for, where are they now? He walks this path alone. There's the emotional pain. And then there's also the social pain of the shaming. And I would contend that from the viewpoint of a lot of the biblical authors, people in this part of the world are what we would call kind of an honor and shame culture. And your sense of personal honor in the eyes of the community mattered way more to you than, like, for us, it's all about individualism. And I don't care if you like me or not, because, it's like, as long as I got enough success or I got enough money, I don't care what you think about me. But not the case in the ancient world, where your reputation and the way that the community thought about you was of vast importance. So much of what the biblical authors highlight is more of the shame of the cross. As we were reading earlier in Luke, where people are just mocking him. Oh, if he's really the king of the Jews, let him save himself. The mockery for them is the big story beyond, well, sure, it hurts to get killed, but they're really focused in on the communal shame and how Jesus goes from being this elevated person in the region to bottom of the barrel, just killed like he's an absolute worthless common criminal. There's also on the cross, I think these, I would call them ironic insults. Wrapping him in a purple robe, which is what a wealthy person would wear, making a crown of thorns, bowing to him, hailing him as King of the Jews. All of this they're doing intending to mock him and insult him, when in fact, ironically, they are proclaiming truth, aren't they? Now, all the stuff they thought they were saying in mockery, they are actually telling the truth. I mean, they're preaching the gospel, and they have no idea that it's what they're doing. But much of the things said about Jesus in mockery on the cross are, ultimately true descriptions of who he was. I think that's kind of the wisdom of God. God likes to, confound the wise, and even our foolishness he can use for his purposes. Reflecting not only on Jesus, but on the subsequent deaths of many of the apostles, I also think that if you're in a situation where someone's trying to force you to say something is false or something is true, or you've been saying this all along, you're either going to deny what you said, you're going to acknowledge that you were telling a lie, or you're going to die. If it wasn't something that you held as an absolute core level true thing, wouldn't most of us cower rather than die for something? If this was just an elaborate scheme by Jesus and his apostles to become famous or rich or powerful, I mean, they got nowhere to live. They're not getting rich off this. They're getting shamed now by all the leaders of their people. You can't point to any material benefit that they had from continuing to talk about Jesus as crucified or as resurrected. And yet all but John according to history and legend, all but John were killed because they refused to stop proclaiming this as true. I do think that to die rather than to deny something indicates a lot of conviction. Whatever Jesus was saying in his life, it all comes to this moment. Will you back down to save yourself? Will you apologize, turn around, do something different to get out of this horrific pain and the loss of your life? And Jesus was content to die, as were those who knew him, rather than to deny all the things that he said. That for me has always, when I was kind of in the end of high school, I started taking a big interest in Christian apologetics. And for me, that was largely because I was raised to be Christian. And so I wondered a lot about, am I doing this because it's what I believe and what I choose, or am I just doing this because it's what I feel like I'm supposed to do and it's what everyone around me does? So that led to me, it's probably one of the first deep dives I've done in my life of anything, where I started really studying a lot about Christianity and especially like comparative world religions, and seeing what all my options were and what do I think about them. But I think for me, I always do circle back to whatever these people were saying. I really believe they think they were telling the truth. So you can say they were delusional or whatever you want to say about them. I don't buy that either for some reasons I can explain. But whatever it was they believed, I do think they actually believed it, because they all didn't profit from it and died horrific, embarrassing deaths because they refused to back down from what it was they said they saw and experienced and what Jesus taught. That to me carries a significant amount of weight, and I think is worth noting. Interested in hearing from you over the next couple minutes. If you'd like to make a comment, what are your feelings about the thief on the cross? The thieves on the cross, one on his right, one on his left. One of the thieves mocked him. The other thief, kind of told the first thief to leave him alone. He's like, this guy is innocent. We deserve what we're getting. And he just says to Jesus, what a thought. He just says, Jesus, remember me. Just remember me. He has no hope, no expectation. He's not trying to place any kind of guilt trip on anybody. He's just saying, I got what I deserved. Jesus, remember me. And Jesus decides to show him profound mercy. Jesus tells that parable of the workers in the field, where you have some that have been out there all day who agree to work for a certain wage, and then some come a few hours later and a few hours later, and some show up basically at quitting time, and he pays everybody the same wage. It's easy to relate to those first people who were saying, hey, why are they getting paid what we're getting paid when we all, our group did most of the work? And Jesus is kind of saying, hey, I can be merciful on the people I want to be merciful to, and what's the harm in me deciding to be generous? So I think God is a generous God and invites us also to be generous. But interested if you have any thoughts about the thief on the cross. Like, what has it meant to you? Can you relate to anyone who might look at that story and say, he's being too easy on the guy? Or, I don't know. I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are about it. This is interesting. One was a goat and one was a sheep, just like everyone in the world. It's right, Joe. As much as Judgment Day language these days is not in vogue, it's not popular, starts in Daniel 12. Jesus reiterates and expounds on it in Matthew 25 about the sheep and goats. Interestingly, when Jesus talks about his criteria for what makes a sheep and what makes a goat, has everything to do with the way that we treat people around us. Are we kind? Are we merciful? Are we generous? Are we like he was? It is a source of hope, isn't it? I would agree, Brenda. I feel like you don't want to take your salvation for granted, and you don't want to be lackadaisical in your faith, because it's just, faith was not cheap. Like, what the price Jesus paid doesn't deserve to be treated like a cheap thing that's easily acquired and easily distributed, right? Like, salvation, we should feel genuinely grateful for it. But I think there's some ways in which acting as if it's precious and I really am only barely saved. If Jesus hadn't done what he did, what hope would I have? I think we should function as if it is very precious to us and, barely something we managed to hang on to. But I would like to think that just as in his life, that in the next life, we will consistently be amazed at God's willingness to be generous, merciful, and kind. It would be representative of how God has been up to this point, that he is kind and merciful. But on the one hand, you should absolutely count on God's grace and his mercy. But on the other hand, I would say don't just say, as long as I got grace, who cares what I do? No, I think your actions are still very important. And don't put God in a position where you're especially undeserving. The two were representative of everyone in the world. Either you accept Christ's divinity or you don't. There's no middle ground. And I think you're right on that, Maggie. No matter how much we might want to kind of nuance or work around, in the end, the things Jesus said do not allow us the possibility of saying, well, he's just a pretty good guy, so I really like his teachings, but I don't think he was divine. Because a big part of what he taught is that he is divine, and for him to claim those things would disqualify him from being a real good person if they weren't true. Comforting to someone who has lost a loved one who never chose Christ publicly. Maybe they did in their last breath. And Sandy, I've had some people like that in my life where, I would have to say there are definitely some good attributes, things I loved about them, ways that they were good in my life, but would have loved for them to have had faith that was at work in them in obvious ways. But the last church I was at, for whatever reason, we seemed to have a lot of success in reaching much older people. And I've been a part of baptizing several folks that were hardly even able to walk, that very, very late in life decided to get baptized and come to Christ. And I tend to think that God probably rejoiced at that as much as he does in anyone's response. So I think God's very merciful. That's good, Joel. Thank you. Where sin increased, grace increased all the more. That's exactly right. Sin increased, but grace increased all the more. And Joel here is a friend of mine from college. And Joel, I'm guessing you're tuning in from Nicaragua, so you're probably our farthest distance student. I think Joel and his wife are with us tonight. So good to see you, buddy, and appreciate that. That's a great reminder. I also love the irony of how God used man's treachery as a source of divine mercy. We talked about the crown of thorns and the purple robe and the things they were saying, but people did the worst that they could, and God was not outdone by that. You can go as far as you can possibly go in fighting God, resisting God, rebelling against God, and you never know when God might mysteriously take all that and with all the force you use to fight it, somehow point that in a direction that actually strengthens his kingdom, maybe even changes your own life. But it would not be the only time in history that God has taken something someone has done intending to be treacherous and used it for good. Just like Joseph and his brothers, that beautiful, tearful reunion with his brothers where they're going, this guy's second in command in Egypt. He can just have our heads cut off. And he doesn't do anything bad to him. He says, no, what you did, you intended to harm me. We're speaking the truth here. Yeah, you intended it for my harm, but God intended it for good. And God wins. It's good to know. All right. So if you're interested, I wanted to just briefly hit on the meaning of the atonement on the cross. And I wanted to reference, this was a pretty heavy theological sermon series I did from September to December of 2019. You can find all of it on our website. It's on YouTube. It's on Facebook. But if you searched our website and look for the series called Peace with God, we've got our sermons in order of date. It's several pages back in there at this point. But the series Peace with God, if you're really interested in knowing more about different ways of thinking of the atonement, I did a pretty deep dive into the crucifixion and what it all means. And so I think that I wanted to reference that as I move into this next thing. If there is a singular moment Cheryl, I mean, you could say it's the crucifixion. I think you could just as easily say it's the resurrection where Jesus crushes Satan's head, because it's really in the resurrection that he's been victorious. Let's make no mistake, people didn't walk away from the crucifixion saying, wow, Jesus won, right? Everyone assumed he had totally lost. So in dying and accepting the worst that Satan could offer, Jesus did kind of pull one over on him. But I'd say it would have to be, in my mind, kind of a conjoined crucifixion and resurrection scenario to think about Jesus really defeating the powers of darkness in the world. So that's my 2 cents on that. But the meaning of the cross, these are some of the ways you can think about it. And this, to me, is part of how you speak to that question I brought up at the beginning of, what difference does it make for someone to have died 2,000 years ago in some other country? What does that have to do with me? Jesus being crucified and resurrected, it does make him a savior. One of the ways we can view him is one who saves others, that he swooped down and, to use Jude's terminology, snatched us from the fire, that Jesus rescued us. Jesus was our ransom. Someone else had a claim over us. Sin had a claim over us. Jesus paid the price of the ransom so that we could be freed. In that sense, he redeemed us, by purchasing us with his blood. Jesus is our substitute. Whatever punishment we deserved, Jesus accepted on himself. Whatever the demands of justice were. And this is a very unpopular angle on the cross these days in many circles, where they don't like the idea of God punishing anybody. Or how could God be so harsh? Or how could we make the crucifixion be just about Jesus suffering? How could that in any way be part of what pleases God? I think that always comes from a place of affluence and comfort. If you had grown up in a nation ruled by a tyrant who murdered your family members and systemically oppressed, and I mean really oppressed, like huge portions of the population, in order for God to be just, something has to be done. Like, if you're a Jew growing up in the 1930s and 40s and you saw all that Hitler did, no way you're going to be okay with God saying, well, I just love everybody. Come on in, Hitler. Like, you're going to have to say, hey, for you to be a good God, you got to do something about what that guy did. And that song is very much what we would call the penal substitutionary theory. Or excuse me, that's the ransom theory. He paid a debt he did not owe, I owed a debt I could not pay. Yeah, tying into the ransom. But Jesus is our substitute, our physician. I've talked with you at length about the importance of viewing sin as if it's a disease or a sickness, and that Jesus is the one who heals us of this sickness, of this disease that is spreading in humanity. In his example on the cross, Jesus is an inspiration to us. We've talked some about his amazing mercy, kindness towards the people harming him. He's an inspiration, and especially in rising from the dead, Jesus is now our champion. He is the one who could win the battle that none of us could win, but we're all on his team and he welcomes us. Jesus is our champion. And to me, much of what Christian worship has to do with is, some people will talk about making Jesus, I want to make God famous. I want to treat Jesus as if he's worthy of fame and honor and respect. And Jesus is our champion. So we speak of him highly. We revere him deeply. So those are some of the ways we can think about the meaning on the cross. This is good. Yeah, the thief on the cross showed great humility. Yeah, he really did, didn't he, Easter Bell? And to your point, quoting James here, he was humble and he did receive grace. And that's an encouraging thought, that if I try to keep myself humble, then it bodes well. It bodes well for me. All right, so I mentioned at the beginning, last week we rolled out our first episode of what we're calling King's Cast. This is just where those of us who are ministers on staff, and we may occasionally bring in some guests, basically we just thought it'd be fun to get together and have conversations around whatever topics come to mind. This first one we started with something I had mentioned in my sermon, kind of got Kevin's brain going in a direction, and so we got together just to talk a little bit about holy spaces and what that looks like in life. So you might find some practical ideas. And if you're wanting to get to know us a little better and a little more about some of us who serve you here at King's Crossing, it's a great way to get in touch with us. And Kevin did a phenomenal job on some of the editing on this video. But look, right now, I think it's only on Facebook. But go to the Facebook videos and you can find that first episode of King's Cast. Already got an endorsement here from Kathy Garcia, and if Kathy likes it, it must be good. So I would encourage you all to check that out. By the way, if you're enjoying any of the content here, always feel free to like, share, repost, send in Messenger. Really appreciate any help you can give us in getting the word out on our church and what we're doing. I've been really excited that despite all the COVID stuff, we have gotten so many people now who do connect with us online, even those who aren't physically close to us, or just like tonight, we've got several people who have moved away but continue staying connected with us, and I enjoy that. But I've had a lot of people now who have visited our church, and their starting point was they found our website, they found our Facebook page, they watched a couple of our class videos, sermon videos, and then decided to come. And so I think what we're doing here is very important, and I hope that you will help us in sharing with your friends and contacts, because this is an easy way to do evangelism. It's a really easy way to connect with people. Yeah, thank you, Merced. I'm glad you did. All right. Next week, I mentioned this, and I'm sorry, I know we've had a couple of wonky weeks already because of my family situation, but next week, I'm just going to say, even though it won't be our greatest presentation of anything, I'm going to go ahead and live stream what we do next week. Same time as usual. It'll be 7 o'clock on Wednesday. And I'm going to have all of our AV volunteers in the booth. We're going to have people singing in the auditorium, some on microphones, some ambiently. If you wanted to just come join us next week and help with kind of singing and participating, we're just going to do some of the typical kinds of things we would be doing in that room so that the people in the booth can practice swapping video angles, learning how the recording works, learning how the mixing works, learning how to run the slides. And we're having to kind of redo all of this because we've got some new things that have to be done to make the stream work. And so we're needing to add more people to that AV volunteer list. But we've already live streamed the last 2 Sundays, but we're trying to just get better and better at how we do this. And so I've been telling them that whenever this got done, we were going to take one Wednesday night and really give this a test drive. That will be next Wednesday night. Again, would love to have you if you want to, even if you don't come by the building, if you wanted to tune in anyways and just give us feedback. It's super helpful if you can say, I'm hearing this, I'm not hearing this, or that's a good camera angle, or it would look better if you went a little closer or a little farther, that kind of thing. So we would like to have your input, because when you got a instant feedback loop, it helps you get better quicker. And so help us make this good. We want this to be something you're proud of and like to show. Joe, if you wanted to show up in a costume, I'm down with that. You know, this is just for practice. So if you wanted to bring your best Moses outfit and deliver us tablets from one of those doors beside the baptistry, I'm not going to stop you. So, next week, though, thank you for your patience. I'm sorry we had a couple of wonky weeks, but next week we'll be changing things up just so we can practice. As always, would invite you to connect with us using the Church Center app. Looks like that icon that you see up top there. And now that's a thought too, Kathy. I mean, someone could bring pizza. I mean, we have to keep talking so we have something to mic and to play around with. But if a few of us would eat while the others would sing and jabber. The warden won't let me. She is no fun. And you said that here where everyone can see it, Joe. I'm going to have to pay for that one. All right. Hope you can join us every week, 7 o'clock. We've got just a few lessons left in this study. We'll pick us a new one. But thank you all for being here, and it's been fun. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night, and we will see you, Lord willing, on Sunday, if not sooner.